I had been planning the hike for months. I didn't want anything fancy. No guided tours, no marked routes, no crowded national parks where every lookout point had a wooden railing and a plaque. I wanted something off-grid, raw, remote. I had been poring over topographical maps of the state for weeks, looking for a place that was just far enough off the main trails to give me that sense of real solitude, but not so remote that it was suicidal. Eventually, I settled on a stretch of mountainous terrain in the northern part of the state, close to the state border, near a place called Dead Man's Hollow. The name didn't scare me. I figured it was one of those old folklore names people gave to places after some settler got lost in the 1800s. There weren't many details about it online. Some people on obscure forums said the area was steep, tough to navigate, and poorly mapped. That sounded perfect to me. I planned for 3 days out. I packed my usual gear, enough water for the first day, water filters for streams, a lightweight tent, compact sleeping bag, first aid kit, a multi-tool, high-calorie snacks, and freeze-dried meals. I had my GPS watch, compass, and printed maps as a backup. I let my brother know where I'd be, left him a screenshot of the area, and gave myself a 2-day grace period in case I needed extra time. It was late September. The air was just starting to get that cool bite in the morning, but the days were still warm enough to hike in a t-shirt if I kept a steady pace. I parked my car in a gravel pull-off near a washed-out Forest Service road. From there, I followed a game trail up into the hills. By the time I hit elevation, my cell signal was gone. I felt great, completely alone. The first day was steady. I pushed through thick underbrush and patches of forest that hadn't seen foot traffic in years. I saw a few deer. Once I startled a black bear rummaging through a dead log, but it bolted as soon as it noticed me. I made camp on a wide ridge, just below the treeline. I could see the valley below glowing with early autumn reds and yellows. It was peaceful, cold, and quiet. The second day, I planned to follow a narrow ridge to a high bluff above Dead Man's Hollow. From there, I would descend down through the hollow, loop around a smaller mountain, and connect with a flat forested area where I could camp again before the last day's return. I packed up at sunrise and started climbing. That ridge was tougher than I thought. It was steep on both sides, with loose shale and crumbling rock. The air thinned a little as I went up, and the wind picked up. I had to crouch low to keep balance in a few places, especially where the trail wasn't clear. I knew I was pushing my luck being alone up here. One misstep, and there'd be no one to help. I made it to the bluff just after noon. The view was huge. You could see for miles. Below me, Dead Man's Hollow cut through the landscape like a scar, thick trees, winding ridgelines, steep canyon walls. Felt ancient. I didn't waste time up there, though. Clouds were moving in, and the wind had gotten stronger. I started down the slope, following what looked like a dry creek bed into the hollow. It was slow going. The descent was rocky and uneven, and the walls of the hollow were close and high, casting shadows over everything. I saw animal tracks, mostly deer, but some larger, deeper prints I couldn't identify at first. I assumed they were bear. I kept my bear spray close. I made it to the bottom around mid-afternoon. The floor of the hollow was surprisingly flat in some places, with dry, cracked mud and thick stands of pine and spruce. It was eerily silent down there. No birds, no squirrels. I walked for maybe a mile, keeping an eye on my GPS. That's when things started to go wrong. The first sign something was off was the GPS. It froze for a second, then flicked to a screen saying, "Acquiring satellites." That was normal for short stretches, but it didn't come back. I pulled out my compass to double-check my bearing, but the needle kept twitching like it couldn't find north. I tapped it. Nothing. I figured I'd just keep heading the same direction and eventually hit the other side of the hollow, where I could start climbing again. The daylight was dimming faster than I expected, and I didn't want to get caught bushwhacking after dark. About half an hour later, I noticed I was walking in circles. Not big ones, just enough that the same pile of wind-fallen branches showed up again. Then a dead pine with a hollowed-out base. Then a crooked stump with moss on one side. I marked a tree with my knife. 10 minutes later, I passed it again. I didn't panic yet. I thought maybe I'd just gotten turned around. I stopped to drink water and eat a granola bar. I pulled out the printed map, but it wasn't helping. The terrain down in the hollow didn't match any of the topography lines. It all looked flatter than it should have, with no clear slope to guide me. It got worse. As the sun dropped, the shadows stretched longer. The wind that had howled up high didn't make it down here. The air was still heavy. I started to get that crawling feeling, like someone was behind me, even though I knew I was alone. I forced myself to ignore it. I walked faster, trying to break the loop, trying to find a slope or stream or even a trail. My legs started to ache. My back was drenched in sweat. I passed the marked tree again, this time from the opposite direction. That's when I stopped. I'd hiked hundreds of miles of wilderness. I'd been in places where trails vanished, where GPS failed, where weather shifted. But I'd never been turned around this badly. I picked a direction, straight as I could, and I just walked. I told myself I'd walk for an hour, no matter what, and not turn until then. 40 minutes in, I hit the creek bed again. Not a new one, the same one I descended on. I finally felt fear set in. Not panic, not yet, but a rising, creeping fear that something was deeply wrong. I set up my tent right there. I didn't want to stumble around in the dark and get hurt. I ate cold food, skipped a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. From what I didn't know, that night I barely slept. I heard branches crack. Not twigs, heavy snaps. Something big. Maybe elk. Maybe bear. Maybe nothing. My brain went wild with every sound. I gripped my knife tight inside the tent, knowing how useless it would be if something did charge. In the morning, there were tracks around my tent. Deep ones. Not bare. Not hooved. Not clear enough to be sure what they were. Long strides. I didn't take a picture. I just wanted to get out. I climbed a ridge, hoping for elevation. Took hours. I slipped once and cut my palm on a sharp rock. I wrapped it with gauze and kept going. At the top, I saw more forest. No roads, no clearings, no signs of people. My GPS blinked once, then died. My compass spun lazily. I walked that day until my feet bled. I rationed food. I stopped at a stream and refilled water, purifying it with tablets. My legs were weak. I was running on fear. By nightfall, I found an old logging road, barely more than 2 tire ruts in the dirt. I almost cried. I followed it the next day, all day, hoping it'd lead somewhere. Late that afternoon, I heard an engine in the distance. I climbed a rise and saw a cabin. Not a ranger station, just a cabin. Old, weathered, no sign of recent life, but a dirt road led away from it, wide enough for a truck. I didn't go inside. I just followed the road, limping now, half crazed with hunger. I hiked for hours until a pickup truck came down the road. I stepped into the middle and waved. The driver braked hard and stared at me like I was a ghost. I must have looked like hell. He drove me to a gas station 30 miles away. I bought food, called my brother, and sat on the curb until he came to get me. I slept for 12 hours straight. Took me a week to feel normal again. 2 weeks before I stopped dreaming about that hollow. I went back over my maps, trying to figure out how I got so turned around. There's still no good explanation. Something about that area doesn't make sense. I haven't hiked alone since. I still go out, but always with someone. And I don't go near Dead Man's Hollow. I don't care what the maps say. That place doesn't want people in it. And next time I get the urge to explore something off-grid, I'll remember what it felt like to lose all sense of direction, to know something was watching, to realize the woods weren't letting go. I had planned the trip for months. I wanted a solo hike, just me, the mountains, and everything I could carry on my back. No texts, no noise, no distractions. I had picked an area in northern Idaho, far from towns or cities. It was supposed to be a 5-day loop, around 70 miles total, with climbs and descents through forests, ridges, and a few river crossings. The weather in September was unpredictable, but I was used to it. I packed my tent, food, water filter, extra layers, emergency kit, and topo maps. I checked my GPS, but I didn't want to rely on it. I preferred to trust the map and compass. That always felt more real to me. I started on a Tuesday morning. The trailhead was empty, just how I liked it. The air was cold but dry, and the trees looked like they were just starting to turn. Everything felt right as I walked. The first day went smooth. I climbed up through dense pine forests and past a few creeks where I filled my bottles. I saw deer, heard birds, and nothing else. No engines, no voices. That night, I camped near a lake tucked into a small valley. I set up my tent just before dark and cooked a quick meal of rice and jerky on my camp stove. The stars were out when I crawled into my sleeping bag. I felt calm. The second day was tougher. The trail gained more elevation, and I crossed a narrow ridge that had a steep drop on one side. The wind picked up, and clouds started forming, so I pushed harder to make it to the next site marked on my map. It was another small lake, this one up high, surrounded by rock fields and crooked trees. That night, the wind never stopped. My tent shook constantly, and I barely slept. I kept checking the stakes and tightening the guy lines, half worried something would snap. But I was still where I needed to be. By the third morning, I was feeling sore but confident. I followed the trail up over the highest point in the loop. From there, I could see the whole valley I'd come from and the one ahead. It looked wide and green, cut by a river that twisted through the bottom. That day, I was supposed to descend and follow the river west for a couple miles before turning back north and climbing to another ridge. Everything looked open from up high, like I could see forever. That was the last time I felt sure of where I was. About an hour into the descent, I came to a trail junction. It wasn't marked, at least not clearly. There was an old wooden sign that had fallen to the ground. The words faded and split from weather. I pulled out my map and tried to line up where I was. I guess the left fork followed the original plan, toward the river. The right fork seemed to climb again, maybe a shortcut back toward the other side of the loop. I made a decision quickly. I took the right. First, it felt right. The trail was narrow but still visible. It wound up along the side of a steep hill, then crossed through patches of pine and open rock. I kept checking the compass, and it was still heading north, which matched what I wanted. But after another hour, things felt off. The trail got faint, less used. It narrowed to barely a path in some places. I started to see more animal tracks than human ones. Elk maybe, or something bigger. The weather changed fast. Clouds came down low, and a light rain started to fall. It was the kind that soaked into your clothes slowly, not hard enough to notice right away. I stopped and put on my rain shell and pack cover. I told myself it was fine. I'd link up with the main trail again soon. It had to circle around. The map didn't show this trail clearly, but I figured it was just old. I kept walking. By late afternoon, I knew I was wrong. The trail ended. It just stopped, no split, no rocks across the path, just faded into thick trees and brush. I dropped my pack and walked ahead a bit, trying to find any sign of continuation. Nothing. I circled wider. Still nothing. It wasn't a trail. It was just a path animals had made, and I'd followed it too far. I stood there, breathing heavy, soaked, and cold. I pulled out the map and compass again. I guessed I had gone northeast instead of northwest. Maybe I could cut across back toward the river. It looked doable. The forest wasn't too thick. I could bushwhack a few miles and rejoin the loop. I marked my position as best I could and started moving. That night, I made camp early. I found a patch of ground under thick trees and set up my tent. I didn't want to hike in the dark, not off-trail. I ate a cold dinner and tried to stay calm. I kept checking the map, trying to guess how far I had drifted. I wasn't worried yet. I still had 4 days of food, and my water filter worked. But I was farther out than I liked. The next day was rough. I bushwhacked through dense forest, stepping over logs and pushing through branches. I didn't make good time. The rain came back, and the ground got slick. I slipped more than once and scraped my hands and knees. My clothes stayed wet, and I could feel blisters forming. Every few minutes, I checked the compass. I was moving west, but it didn't feel right. I started seeing different trees, thicker, older, some covered in moss. The air smelled different, like rot. That afternoon, I found something strange. It was a hunting blind, old, falling apart, built up in a tree. The ladder was rotted and the platform sagged. But someone had been here before. I searched around the base and found a rusted can, maybe from beans or soup. No trail, though. No sign of where they came from or went. I moved on, faster now, trying to make up time. By nightfall, I still hadn't found the river. I hadn't found anything. Just trees and hills and more silence. I was getting nervous now. My legs ached, and my pack felt heavier. I found a place to camp and used my emergency beacon to ping my last known GPS spot. It showed I was about 5 miles off the loop. That didn't seem bad, but the terrain was all wrong. The 5th day, I ran into trouble. I woke up to animal tracks around my tent. Big ones, probably a bear. They circled once, then wandered off. I hadn't heard it in the night, but the prints were fresh. My heart was pounding as I packed up. I kept bear spray clipped to my chest and made noise as I walked, calling out every few steps. I didn't want to surprise anything. I moved slow, scanning the trees, watching every ridge. I thought I saw movement a few times, but it was just branches in the wind. Around noon, I twisted my ankle. I stepped wrong on a mossy rock and felt the sharp pain shoot up my leg. I fell hard and cursed loud. I laid there for a minute, eyes shut, breathing through clenched teeth. It didn't feel broken, but it was swollen fast. I wrapped it tight and tried to walk. It hurt like hell, but I could limp. I couldn't afford to stop. I still hadn't seen the river or the trail. I kept going. That night was the worst. I set up camp near a grove of dead trees. The ground was soft and quiet. Too quiet. I barely slept. Every sound outside felt close. I held the bear spray in one hand and my knife in the other. At one point, I heard something moving outside. Heavy, slow steps. I held my breath. I don't know how long it lasted, but it moved away eventually. I never saw it. The 6th day, I ran out of food. I had eaten the last of my supplies the night before. I still had water, but only because I'd found a small stream earlier. It was muddy and slow, but better than nothing. I filtered it and kept walking, now using a stick as a crutch. My ankle was worse. Every step felt like fire. By the afternoon, I saw something that stopped me cold. An old logging road. Faint, overgrown, but real. Cut through the trees like a scar. I limped toward it and followed it, hoping it led somewhere. Anything was better than the woods. I followed it for hours. No tire tracks, but it was clear enough to move fast. At least faster than before. Just before dark, I found a sign. Bent, rusted, but legible. It had a number on it, probably an old Forest Service road. That meant I was close to something. I followed it through the night, not stopping, not caring how tired I was. And just after dawn on the 7th day, I heard the sound of an engine. A low hum, distant but real. I hobbled toward it, waving my arms like a lunatic. A pickup truck came into view, crawling up the road. The driver stopped when he saw me. I must have looked like hell, muddy, wet, limping, eyes wide. He helped me into the truck and gave me water. He said I was almost 20 miles from the nearest marked trail. I had wandered far off course. He drove me back to town, where I saw a doctor and called my family. The whole thing had lasted a week. I was hungry, exhausted, and lucky. The ankle wasn't broken, just badly sprained. I rested for weeks after. I thought about that trip a lot, about the wrong turn, about how fast things can go bad, about how quiet and big the woods really are. No ghosts, no monsters, just bad choices, wild land, and the slow, creeping fear of being truly alone. I still hike, but I double-check every trail, every fork, every map. I've been planning this hike for over a month. The trail wasn't well known, and that's what drew me to it. I'd found it through an old forum where a few people had mentioned it was still mostly untouched, tucked away in the higher parts of the mountains in western Montana. No established campground, no ranger station, not even a marked trailhead. Just a rough forest road that led to a clearing where some hikers had parked before. From there, it was all off-grid. I wanted that. I wanted the quiet and the isolation. I packed carefully. A new internal frame pack, freeze-dried food for a week, a lightweight tent, water filter, solar battery pack, first aid kit, flare gun, emergency blanket, satellite beacon, bear spray, knife, and a .357 revolver I always carried when hiking solo. I'd done long trips before, but this one felt a little different. Not necessarily dangerous, just serious. I double-checked everything, marked my route on topographic maps, left a copy with my brother, and gave him a check-in schedule for the Garmin. The drive to the forest road was long. Once I got off the main highway, the terrain turned rough quickly. Tall pine trees closed in tight around the dirt road. I drove slow, bumping over rocks and potholes, finally stopping in a wide patch of grass at the end of the road. There wasn't another car in sight. I got out and listened. Nothing but birds and wind. I spent the first few hours climbing through woods that were thicker than I'd expected. The ground was uneven, covered in fallen limbs and tangled undergrowth. There was no path. I used a compass and kept checking my GPS to make sure I was following the rough course I'd planned, aiming for a ridgeline that led into a narrow valley where I hoped to set up camp. It was slow going, and by the time I found a good spot, flat ground next to a small stream, it was almost evening. I pitched my tent under a stand of spruce and gathered some deadfall for a small fire. That first night was calm. Cold, but calm. I stayed close to the fire, cooked a meal from one of my freeze-dried packs, and watched the stars come out between the trees. No phone service, of course, but the satellite messenger worked fine. I sent a quick check-in to my brother and then turned in. I slept light, the kind of half-sleep you fall into when you're alone in the woods. The next morning, I packed up and pushed deeper into the mountains. The terrain got steeper and rockier. I climbed a ridge that gave me a view of the valley ahead. It was a deep cut between two hills, full of dense trees and not a sign of any trail. Perfect. I scrambled down a slope, slipping once and cutting my hand on a sharp rock, but nothing serious. As I moved through the valley, I started noticing things that felt off. It started with a tree that had been chopped. Cleanly, not broken or fallen. Chopped like with an axe. But the tree wasn't part of any trail, and there were no markings, no blazes on trunks. I figured maybe a hunter or trapper had come through sometime last season. Then I found a small fire ring. Rocks in a circle, blackened from soot. No fresh ash, but not old either. Maybe a few weeks. It didn't bother me exactly, but I hadn't expected signs of other people. This wasn't a normal place for hikers. There weren't even old logging roads nearby. I kept going, but I felt more alert. I made camp again that night on a flat patch of mossy ground near a boulder field. The forest here was darker. The trees grew tight together, and the canopy blocked most of the light. It got cold fast. I lit a fire and sat with my back to the boulder, eating slowly, listening to the woods. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps. Not animals, something heavier. But it stopped before I could be sure, and I told myself it was just a deer or elk moving through. The next day, I woke up to find something had disturbed my gear. My backpack had been dragged a few feet from where I left it. It wasn't torn, nothing was missing, but it was clearly moved. I'd zipped it and leaned it against a tree before bed. Now it was lying on its side 10 feet away. I checked for prints, but the ground was too hard. I looked around for signs of bears, scat, claw marks, but saw nothing. That's when I started getting that tight feeling in my chest. I didn't like it. Still, I packed up and moved on. By afternoon, I reached the far end of the valley. There was a narrow slope leading up to another ridge. I was tired, but I wanted the high ground. I made the climb, using roots and rocks to pull myself up, and when I got to the top, I saw something that stopped me cold. It was a small structure, just barely visible through the trees. Not a cabin, a shelter, built from branches, stacked and tied with rope or vines. It was shaped like a triangle, leaned up against a fallen log. Not old either. I crept closer, every part of me on edge. The floor of the shelter was covered in pine needles, and inside, I saw bones. Not human, animal, deer maybe. The ribs had been stripped clean. There were pieces of fur, a bit of cloth, pot half buried in dirt. This wasn't a hunting blind. Felt like someone had been living out here. Recently, I turned around and left fast, not running, but not wasting time. I made it down the slope and moved deeper into the woods, trying to put distance between me and the shelter. I didn't like the idea of being watched. I didn't want to find out who built that thing. I found a spot next to a rock outcrop and didn't light a fire that night. Just crawled into my tent and stayed quiet. Somewhere after midnight, I heard movement again. Closer this time. Definite. Steady steps, crunching leaves. I held my breath and reached for the revolver. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't move. The steps circled once, slow and deliberate, then faded into the trees. At first light, I packed up and started hiking back toward the direction I'd come from. I didn't want to stay out another night. I figured I'd break it into 2 days, sleep one more time, then make it to the car. That was the plan. But by midday, I started feeling like I was being followed. I kept hearing faint noises behind me, branches cracking, leaves moving. I'd stop, listen, and it would go quiet. I tried not to panic, just kept hiking, making good time. But when I stopped to fill my water bottle at a stream, I saw a footprint on the bank. Not mine. Barefoot. Wide toe spread. I stared at it for a long time. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't pitch the tent either. I just wrapped myself in the emergency blanket, sat in the dark with the revolver in my hand, and waited. I didn't hear anything, but I felt it. That presence. Like someone was just outside the edge of the trees, watching. When morning came, I took off fast. No breakfast, no rest, just packed and moved. My legs were sore, my feet blistered, but I didn't care. I pushed hard, following the GPS back toward where I'd parked. I was halfway through a thick stretch of woods when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whistle. Not a bird, not the wind. A long, steady human whistle. Just 2 notes, repeating. From behind me, I didn't look back. I ran. The pack bounced against my shoulders. My boots slipped on wet leaves, but I kept going. I don't know how long I ran. Maybe 15 minutes straight, until I stumbled into a clearing and dropped to my knees, gasping. I listened. Nothing. No whistle. No footsteps. I waited, caught my breath, then kept moving. I was close now, maybe 5 or 6 miles from the car. I could make it. I had to. A couple hours later, I recognized the ridge near the old logging road. I was maybe a mile out when I saw another sign. Hanging from a branch above the trail was a piece of fabric. Torn, faded red. Looked like it came from a shirt. I didn't stop to study it. I moved faster, heart pounding. When I finally saw the glint of my car through the trees, I nearly cried. I burst out of the woods, threw my pack into the back seat, and slammed the door shut. I didn't look back. I started the engine and peeled out, tires spinning in dirt. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again, 30 miles down the mountain. I pulled over, sat with the engine running, and just breathed. My hands were shaking. My shirt was soaked in sweat. I looked in the mirror and realized I'd scraped my face at some point. Blood was dried on my cheek. I drove straight home, didn't sleep until the next night. When I told the Forest Service about what I saw, the shelter, the footprint, the whistle, they didn't say much. Took down the report, promised to check it out. I never heard back. I haven't hiked alone since then. I still think about that trip, especially at night. I keep wondering what would have happened if I stayed one more day. If I turned around when I heard the whistle. If I tried to talk to whoever was out there. But I didn't, and I'm still here. That's enough for me. I never considered myself an expert hiker, but I did enjoy getting out into the woods when I could. There was something about the quiet that spoke to me, the way the world slowed down once you were deep enough into nature, far away from the buzz of everyday life. My plan for this particular trip was simple: a 2-day hike through a well-marked trail in a national park. I had done it before, and though it wasn't the easiest hike, I was confident I could handle it. But I didn't realize that this hike would be unlike any I had done before. I set out early in the morning, my backpack packed with the usual gear: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my trusty map. The trail was supposed to be around 12 miles one way, which seemed like a good distance for a short weekend trip. It wasn't the hardest trail, but it wasn't exactly easy either. The weather was perfect, cool, with the sun just starting to rise and paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, the kind of morning you wish would never end. The first few miles were calm, uneventful. The path wound through thick trees, the ground soft with a carpet of fallen leaves. I passed a few other hikers, but it wasn't crowded. The air smelled fresh, full of pine and earth, and the sounds around me were those of nature. Birds, wind through the trees, the distant rush of a stream somewhere far off. It was peaceful, and for a moment, I thought I might settle into this feeling for the rest of my life. But things started to feel different once I hit the halfway mark. The trail began to narrow, the trees grew thicker, and the light dimmed as the canopy above thickened. I found myself looking around a lot more, trying to catch glimpses of the trail markers, which seemed to be spaced farther apart than I remembered. I'd been on this trail before, but something about it today felt off. Maybe it was the way the air had turned heavy, or the silence. It wasn't the usual peaceful silence. It was almost expectant. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation. The further I went, the more I felt like I was losing track of time. The trail was supposed to loop back after 12 miles, but as I checked my watch, I realized I'd been walking for almost 5 hours and hadn't even seen a sign indicating I was halfway through the loop. The deeper I went, the more I started to notice the small things. Twigs breaking underfoot that didn't belong to me, shadows flickering from the corner of my vision, sounds that didn't match the environment. It was as if something or someone was nearby, but every time I looked around, there was nothing. At one point, I came across a large boulder that I needed to climb over. As I scrambled to the top, I spotted a trail marker on the far side. Relief washed over me, but when I looked back to where I had just climbed from, I noticed something strange. The path I had just walked seemed wrong. The trees were spaced differently, the way the rocks lined up didn't feel right, as if the landscape had subtly changed since I passed through it. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But the unease in my gut wouldn't go away. By now, I was seriously considering turning around and heading back the way I came. But I couldn't remember the exact way I had come. There had been a moment when I had stopped paying attention to my steps, and now everything seemed unfamiliar. The trail wasn't as clear as it had been before, and the markers were harder to spot. I thought about calling out, but the silence was oppressive. Even the usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, squirrels, seemed to have quieted. A chill ran down my spine, but I pushed through. I had come this far. I had to keep going. I reasoned that I could make it to the next trail marker and figure out where I was. Surely I could find my way. As the minutes stretched into hours, my sense of direction became more muddled. The trail seemed to split off in random places, and each time I chose a path, it didn't lead me where I expected. The markers had become fewer, and when I did find one, it was harder to discern which direction I was meant to go. The sun was now dipping behind the horizon, and I realized I hadn't come across a good campsite or a shelter for a while. There was no obvious place to stop and rest, no clear path forward. The weight of my backpack felt heavier, and with each step, I grew more tired. I had been on plenty of long hikes before, but this felt different. The sense of isolation, the oppressive silence, the uncertainty, it was all wearing on me. And then the real panic set in. I was lost, completely lost. I stopped in my tracks and looked around, trying to see something familiar, anything that would give me an idea of where I was. But all I could see were trees, dense, thick trees. The trail had disappeared beneath the leaves, and there was no way to know which way to go. My map was useless now, and my phone had no signal. I felt the rising panic in my chest, my breath growing shallow. I had trained myself to stay calm in situations like this, but the reality of being completely alone, in the middle of nowhere with no way to orient myself, was suffocating. I forced myself to sit down on a nearby rock. I needed to think. Panic wouldn't help me get out of this situation. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe deeply, focusing on the sounds of my breath and the rustling of the trees. I had to get control of my mind, had to stop myself from spiraling. I had a flashlight, extra water, and enough food to survive a night, maybe more. I could camp here and wait for daylight, but I had to be smart about it. I set up a small camp using my emergency gear. I didn't start a fire. There was no need for attention in this quiet, eerie forest. I had no idea if anyone else was around, if there was anyone to hear a call for help. I huddled in my tent, the darkness outside swallowing everything. The quiet was unbearable. Not the peaceful quiet I had hoped for, but the kind of silence that felt like it could close in on you, like you were never meant to be there. I lay in my sleeping bag, fighting off the urge to get up and check the surroundings. I had no choice but to wait until morning. My mind kept racing, thinking of ways I could get out of here, ways to retrace my steps. But each thought seemed to lead to a dead end. How had I gotten this far off track? As the night dragged on, I finally fell into an uneasy sleep, exhausted both physically and mentally. But the sleep was broken, filled with dreams of dark shapes moving just beyond my tent, of whispers in the wind, of something unseen watching me. I woke up multiple times, each time feeling more disoriented than before. When morning came, it was slow and reluctant, the sun barely breaking through the canopy. I felt groggy, unsure of how long I had actually slept. My first instinct was to pack up and try to find my way back, but I was terrified of getting even more lost. I needed a plan, something logical, not driven by fear. I decided to follow my gut. I went to the spot where I had set up camp and looked around again, trying to make sense of the landscape. The trees were still unfamiliar, but I noticed a faint trail marker on a tree a little ways off. I made my decision then. I would follow it. Hours passed. The forest started to change again, more open areas giving way to rougher terrain. Just when I was about to lose hope, I stumbled upon a signpost, a real one, the kind that marked the official trail. My heart jumped. I wasn't out of the woods yet, but I had found my way. Eventually, I found the main trail and, from there, the trailhead where I had parked my car. The relief was overwhelming, like I had just returned from another world. The experience left me shaken, but it also reminded me of how much respect the wilderness deserves. There's beauty in the unknown, but there's also danger. It's easy to lose your way, even when you think you know the path. I learned a lot from that hike, not just about hiking, but about myself. I had underestimated the wilderness, and in doing so had nearly paid the price. But I made it out, and that was something I could be proud of. I had been looking forward to that weekend for months. Life had been hard lately. Work had gotten stressful, and I hadn't been sleeping right. There was something about waking up in the city that made every morning feel like a chore. I felt trapped. The noise, the buildings, the endless faces. It just drained me. So when I saw the weather forecast show just a slight chance of rain and the mountain trail I'd been wanting to hike for over a year finally reopened, I figured it was time to get out of town and clear my head. I packed my gear the night before. I double-checked everything: waterproof hiking boots, thick socks, layered clothing, my rain jacket, gloves, a hat, my emergency blanket, multi-tool, first aid kit, matches, extra food, headlamp, backup flashlight, and spare batteries. I brought a new portable water filter too. My tent was lightweight and my sleeping bag was rated for below freezing temps, just in case. My phone was fully charged, and I packed my small power bank as well. I had a paper map in case the signal dropped. I'd hiked solo before, and I knew how fast conditions could turn. But still, I felt confident. Too confident, maybe. The trailhead started near a small gravel pull-off about 2 hours outside the city. I got there just after sunrise. The air was cool and crisp. The clouds were low, but I told myself that was normal for the elevation. The trail climbed slowly at first, winding through tall pines. The forest was quiet, with just the occasional rustle of squirrels or the flutter of birds. The damp earth smelled fresh. After a while, I settled into a rhythm. Each step cleared more clutter from my mind. By noon, the sky started looking worse. I stopped to eat a protein bar and noticed the wind picking up. The clouds had dropped lower, and the sun was gone completely. It wasn't raining yet, but the air had that heavy feeling, like it was about to open up. I hesitated, then checked the map again. I was already past the halfway point to the high ridge where I planned to camp for the night. I figured I'd just push through, get to the top before dark, and set up before the storm hit. The mistake I made was assuming the storm would be short. But it wasn't just a quick downpour. It hit hard and fast. About an hour later, the first drops started. Cold and fat. I pulled on my rain jacket and kept moving. The rain grew louder. The wind started to howl. Trees creaked around me. The trail, which had been clear earlier, turned muddy fast. My boots began to slip. Roots became slick. Water started to run down the path like a shallow stream. I kept telling myself to keep going, that I could tough it out. I didn't want to backtrack all the way down. I was wrong. By the time I reached the ridge, the rain had turned into something else entirely. Sheets of water fell sideways. My jacket kept the top half of me dry, but everything below the knees was soaked. My hands were numb. I found a flat spot a few feet off the trail, surrounded by trees that broke the wind a little, and I set up the tent with fingers that barely worked. Inside the tent, I stripped out of the wet clothes, stuffed them in a plastic bag, and changed into my dry set. I curled into my sleeping bag, shivering, and listened to the storm tear through the forest. The rain slammed the tent like fists. I checked my phone. 1 bar of signal. I quickly texted my brother that I'd reached my spot and was camping for the night. No reply, but at least it went through. I barely slept. The wind never stopped. At some point deep in the night, I heard a crack and then a heavy thud somewhere nearby. A tree had gone down. I don't think I've ever felt that kind of tension in my chest. I just lay there, staring at the tent ceiling, listening for more cracks. By morning, everything was soaked. The rain had eased a little, but the fog was thick and cold. My gear felt damp. My fingers ached from the cold air. I packed up quickly, hoping to head back down before things got worse again. But the trail was gone. It wasn't just harder to follow, it was erased. Mudslides had torn chunks of the hillside away. Parts of the path had collapsed entirely. Trees had fallen over it. What was once a clear trail was now a mess of branches, muddy slopes, and rushing water. I followed what I thought was the trail for maybe half an hour before I realized I'd gone the wrong way. I turned around, tried again, but the forest didn't look right anymore. Everything was gray. The fog made it impossible to tell distances. I kept checking my map, trying to match the curves of the terrain, but the landmarks were all hidden. I started to panic, but I didn't let it show. I just kept moving, thinking I'd eventually reconnect with the path. Then I slipped. It wasn't a big fall, just a quick slide down a muddy bank. But when I landed, something twisted in my ankle. Pain shot up my leg. I bit down hard, trying not to yell. I got back up slowly. The ankle held my weight, but barely. I limped forward, dragging my foot behind me. Every step hurt. The hours blurred after that. I kept thinking I'd find the trail, but I didn't. I found streams, trees, and rocks, but not the trail. The rain picked up again around mid-afternoon. I was cold, wet, and alone. That night, I camped in the least worst spot I could find, under a thick cluster of trees that gave a little shelter from the wind. I was almost out of dry clothes. My sleeping bag was damp from the inside now, from sweat and moisture. I couldn't start a fire. The wood was too wet. I ate jerky in the dark and listened to the storm creep back in. The next day, my ankle was worse. I could barely walk. I used a branch as a crutch, but it slowed me down badly. I had no idea where I was. The mountains all looked the same. My phone had no signal at all now. I stopped checking it. The battery was getting low. I saw no other hikers, no helicopters, no sound of roads, just the forest. By the third day, I started rationing food. I had enough for maybe 2 more days if I didn't move too much. But I couldn't just sit and wait. No one knew I was lost. They just thought I was out for the weekend. I had told my brother I'd be back by Monday, but it was Sunday already. I tried to follow the water. I remembered reading somewhere that following streams can sometimes lead you to people or roads, but that wasn't working. The stream I followed just twisted deeper into the woods, eventually breaking into multiple directions. I picked one and hoped for the best. That night, I slipped again. I was climbing down a steep slope when the mud gave way. I slid maybe 20 feet before crashing into some rocks at the bottom. I hit my shoulder hard. It didn't break, but it felt like something was torn. I could barely lift my arm. I lay there for a while, not moving, just trying to breathe. It was almost dark. My ankle was throbbing. My shoulder was burning. I couldn't cry. I didn't even have the energy. I just stared at the trees above me, watching the fog roll through their branches. I remember thinking that I might not get out. The next morning, something changed. I was limping along the edge of another stream when I saw something ahead. Something straight. It was a log, cut clean on both ends. Man-made. I followed it and found more signs of logging. And then, after maybe an hour of painful walking, I saw it. A dirt road. I almost didn't believe it was real. It was muddy and had deep tire grooves, but it was clearly a road. I followed it, dragging my leg behind me for what felt like miles. I started yelling. Not words, just noise. I hadn't heard my own voice in days. My throat cracked from it. It was late afternoon when I heard the engine. A small utility truck came around the corner. The man inside hit the brakes and stared at me like he'd seen a ghost. I didn't even wave. I just stood there, shaking, rain dripping off my hood. He jumped out and helped me into the passenger seat. He gave me a bottle of water and turned the heater on full blast. I leaned back against the seat, closing my eyes, as he radioed someone about finding a lost hiker. I don't remember the drive out. I just remember the heat and the smell of old coffee in his truck. They took me to a rural clinic a couple hours later. I had a bad sprain, bruised ribs, and early signs of hypothermia. They kept me overnight. The nurse told me I was lucky to be found when I was. A couple more days, she said, and I might not have made it. When I got back to the city, everything felt louder than before. The cars, the people, the lights. I stayed inside for a week. I didn't go to work. I didn't talk to anyone. I just sat there, thinking about the trees, the wind, and that moment I slipped down the bank and everything changed. I still hike now, but I plan more carefully. I check the weather twice. I tell more people exactly where I'm going and when. I carry more emergency gear, and I don't push through storms. That trail broke something in me, not forever, but enough to change how I see the woods. Nature doesn't care how prepared you think you are. It doesn't care about your schedule or your mood or your confidence. It just is. And sometimes it's too much. But I made it out. And now every step I take feels heavier, more real. Like I understand the cost of getting lost and the luck it takes to come back. The day I decided to hike that trail started like any other. Sunny skies, the kind of day you hope for when you've planned a trip to the mountains. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. My gear was packed, my boots laced tight, and I felt a familiar sense of anticipation that always comes with stepping into the wilderness. Hiking had always been a quiet escape for me. The trails around here in the Appalachian Mountains offered a mix of solitude and beauty that I couldn't resist. The trail I chose this time was a lesser-known one, a narrow path winding through dense trees and rocky inclines. It wasn't far from a popular camping spot, but it was remote enough that not many people used it. I'd been hiking for hours when I began to notice how quiet it was. The kind of silence you can only get deep in the woods where there's no traffic, no sounds of city life, just the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. But then, as I continued on, I began to feel something odd. It was subtle at first, just a slight unease that I couldn't put my finger on. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was more like a quiet pressure building in the back of my mind. Something about the trail didn't feel right, but I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just my imagination. I'd hiked these mountains before, after all. The trail narrowed as I moved further into the forest, the trees thickening around me. The air felt cooler here, almost damp, and the forest floor was covered with a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. The kind of place where, if you weren't paying attention, you could easily lose track of where you were. The markers on the trees were faded, almost impossible to make out in the dim light. But I trusted the map I had on my phone, and the general direction seemed correct. At some point, I stopped for a break. I sat on a fallen log and took a long swig of water, looking around. There was nothing out of the ordinary, no sounds of people, No signs of wildlife beyond the distant rustle of leaves. Everything was just quiet. Just the kind of quiet that's easy to overlook when you're used to it. But today, for some reason, it felt different, heavier, as though the woods were waiting for something. After a few minutes, I decided to keep going. I should have turned back then. If I had, none of what happened next would have come to pass. But at that moment, I was still chasing that feeling, the thrill of adventure, the pull of the unknown. I stood up, hoisted my pack over my shoulder, and started down the path again. As I walked, I noticed how the landscape was changing. The trees seemed older now, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The path became less defined, the ground rising and falling more sharply. I had to pay more attention to where I was stepping, my boots sliding over loose rocks and uneven ground. The trail was steep here, and I found myself breathing a little harder. Then I heard it, the snap of a twig behind me. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The air was still again, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I turned around quickly, half expecting to see another hiker or someone making their way down the trail, but there was nothing. No one in sight. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon, some small animal scurrying through the underbrush. But that unease, the pressure in the back of my mind, didn't go away. I continued walking, but now my eyes were scanning the trees more frequently. I kept my pace steady, trying to keep my breathing even, but every step felt like it was taking me deeper into the forest. The silence around me had become more oppressive, as if the woods were closing in. After a while, the trail began to split, two paths diverging to the left and right. I looked at my map, which didn't seem to show any trail markers here, just a vague indication that the path would eventually loop back around. Without any clear guidance, I decided to take the left path, hoping it would lead me in the right direction. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew thicker, blocking out more light, and the ground underfoot became slick with dampness. The air smelled different here, earthy, rich, but almost stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I wiped my forehead with my sleeve, feeling the sweat gather there despite the cool air. I was starting to feel like I was alone in this part of the woods. Really alone. Not just physically, but in a way that felt isolating. The path was growing less and less defined, the trees leaning in closer, their branches tangling overhead, as if they were trying to close me off from the world outside. The silence was profound now, oppressive in its stillness. A sudden chill ran down my spine. I stopped in my tracks, looking around. There was something off about the air here, thick, like it had weight to it. The wind had died completely, and I could hear the faintest rustle of leaves far off in the distance, but not near me, not close enough to make sense. I pulled out my phone to check my map again. The battery was low, but it still had enough power to give me a vague sense of my location. There was no marked trail nearby, nothing that seemed to make sense. The map was blurry, pixelated in the dim light, and I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. I needed to find a way out. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. That nagging feeling of unease that had started as a whisper was now an insistent, clawing fear. I wasn't just lost, I realized. I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I turned around to head back the way I came, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was subtle at first, like the air had thickened, like something was watching me. But as I walked, I heard a sound, a faint crunch of leaves underfoot. Someone or something was following me. I picked up my pace. I wasn't running, not yet, but I was moving faster, trying to put distance between myself and whatever was back there. The trail behind me was still obscured by thick trees, but I could swear I saw something move just out of the corner of my eye. Too quick to be a person, too deliberate to be an animal. My breath came faster, but I refused to break into a full-on sprint. I had to stay calm. I had to think. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead, moving as quickly as I dared, until I reached a small clearing. There, I stopped, realizing I had no idea where I was anymore. The map had been useless, the trail markers were few and far between, and I had lost all sense of direction. I knew I needed to call for help, but my phone was nearly dead. I didn't know how much longer I could last out here, but I also knew I had to keep moving. Couldn't stay put. Not with the feeling of someone behind me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and began walking again, making sure to stay on the trail, despite how narrow and indistinct it was becoming. After what felt like hours, I saw a break in the trees up ahead, a ridge, and beyond that, a glimpse of sunlight filtering through. My heart skipped. It was a sign. There was hope. I pushed through the last stretch of thick undergrowth, my legs burning, and finally broke through the tree line. The sight of the open sky was like a balm to my soul. The trail I had started on was just beyond the ridge, and as I stood there, catching my breath, I realized that I had made it back. I had found the right path, the one that would lead me out of the woods. As I walked the final stretch of trail back to the parking lot, the panic slowly began to subside. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees, but I felt relief wash over me. I wasn't lost anymore. I had made it through. I wouldn't hike that trail again, not alone, and I would never forget the feeling of being watched, the strange pressure that followed me through the woods. But I had made it out, and that, in the end, was the most important thing. The hike was supposed to be simple, nothing more than a few hours on a quiet, forgotten trail in the middle of nowhere. I'd read about it online, an old path that ran through a thick stretch of woods not too far from the nearest town. No one really went there anymore, which, to be honest, was part of the appeal. I had been looking for a break from the usual crowd and noise of the world, and this seemed like the perfect place to clear my head. I drove out early that morning, my car cutting through the fog as I neared the trailhead. The air was cool, but I knew it would warm up quickly once I started moving. I parked my car in the small gravel lot, the only other vehicle being an old, rusty truck that had clearly been there for a while. No one around, just how I liked it. I should have known, though, that things weren't going to go as planned. I always should have known. But hindsight is 20/20, and that morning, I wasn't thinking about anything other than getting a good hike in. The first few miles were easy. The trail twisted and turned, winding through tall trees that blocked out most of the sun. It was peaceful, except for the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. The birds were quiet that morning, which I thought was odd, but I shrugged it off. Maybe they were just still waking up. Around an hour in, I reached a section of the trail that narrowed, the path now a bit more rugged, with rocks and tree roots sticking out of the ground. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing deeper as I moved further from the trailhead. There was no sound except for my breathing and the soft rustling of the leaves. As I rounded a corner, I saw something strange up ahead, a tree standing by itself, twisted and gnarled. Its branches were wide, like arms reaching out to grab something, and it looked like it had been struck by lightning years ago. What caught my attention, though, was the strange marking carved into its bark. It was deep, jagged, and it resembled a strange symbol, almost like a spiral. My first thought was that it was some kind of old trail marker, but it didn't look like any trail marker I'd seen before. I stopped for a moment studying it. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't place why. It didn't seem like it belonged in the forest. But I pushed the thought aside and kept going, telling myself it was just the remnant of someone's old carving. No big deal. The next few miles took me deeper into the woods, and the further I went, the stranger the trail became. The trees grew closer together, blocking out more of the light, and the air felt thick, almost heavy. I began to notice that the path wasn't as well marked as it had been earlier. In fact, I started to doubt whether I was even still on the right trail. But I kept moving, hoping I would reach the clearing I had seen on the map sooner rather than later. That's when I noticed the first sign that something was very, very wrong. The sound of running water started to fade. I had been hearing a small creek off to my left for a while, but now it was completely silent. The air felt still, and I realized I hadn't seen any wildlife for a long time either. No birds, no insects, not even a squirrel darting across the path. It was unnervingly quiet. I glanced around, but there was nothing to see but trees and rocks and the occasional flash of sunlight filtering through the leaves. No sign of a road or any other trail. I checked my watch. I'd been hiking for nearly 3 hours now, and according to the map, I should have reached the clearing by now. I paused, uncertain. I wasn't lost. At least I didn't think I was, but something told me I should turn around. I'd seen enough movies to know that when the forest gets too quiet, when the trail starts to disappear, it's time to leave. But my stubbornness got the better of me, and I pushed on, convinced that I could just keep following the trail, that everything would be fine. Then I heard something. It was faint at first, just a whisper of sound, but it was there. A low, almost imperceptible thud, like something heavy hitting the ground, followed by a faint rustling. It was coming from somewhere ahead, but I couldn't tell where. I stopped dead in my tracks, every muscle in my body going tense. I turned around slowly, scanning the trees behind me. No one there, nothing moving. I stood there for a while, just listening, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I heard it again, a muffled thud, followed by more rustling. It was closer this time. My breath quickened, my pulse racing in my ears. But then it stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but the forest was completely silent once again. Against every instinct in me, I decided to keep going. I couldn't let my imagination get the best of me. I had come out here to enjoy a quiet hike, and I wasn't going to let a few strange sounds ruin it. But that was when I noticed something else. A small pile of rocks, carefully stacked in the middle of the trail. It wasn't a cairn, this wasn't a trail marker. The rocks were just there, in a neat little stack, almost as if someone had placed them deliberately. I bent down to get a closer look, but before I could touch them, I heard the thud again, louder this time, and then the rustling. It was coming from behind me. My heart skipped a beat as I spun around, my eyes frantically scanning the area. There was nothing, just the thick forest and the empty trail. No footsteps, no sign of anyone. My mind raced. Who would be out here? There wasn't anyone else on the trail when I arrived. I hadn't passed anyone, and no one had passed me. But there was no denying the feeling now. Someone was following me. I started walking faster, my pace quickening, my mind screaming at me to get out of there. The air felt thick again, like something was closing in. My breath came faster, but no matter how quickly I moved, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. And then I heard it again, a footstep, a sharp crunch, followed by another, closer this time. I froze. This wasn't in my head. Someone was out there. I spun around once more, but this time, I didn't see anything. Just the trees, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. The sun starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the trail. My heart was hammering now, and I realized I had to get back to my car. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I turned around, gripping the straps of my pack tightly, and started walking as fast as I could manage. But the forest didn't feel right. The trees seemed to close in tighter as I moved, and the shadows grew longer. Every step I took felt like it led me deeper into the woods, not back toward the trailhead. I wasn't getting any closer to my car. The footsteps came again, closer this time. The rustling grew louder. I could hear someone moving through the brush behind me. I broke into a full sprint then, my feet pounding the trail, my breath ragged and fast. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get out of those woods. But the further I ran, the more lost I felt. The trail seemed to twist and bend in ways it hadn't before. And then I saw it, the clearing. It was a small open space, a patch of grass surrounded by trees, just a few feet wide. But when I stepped into it, I felt like I could breathe again. It was like a weight had lifted off my chest, and I wasn't being followed anymore. I kept walking, slowly, cautiously, keeping an eye on the trees around me. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and when I did, I didn't look back. That night, I locked myself in my apartment and refused to think about the trail, about the footsteps, about whatever I had felt back there. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to, but I've never gone back to that place. I don't know who or what I heard out there, but I can't shake the feeling that something was watching me. And no matter how hard I try to forget it, the memory of that strange, twisted forest is always there in the back of my mind. I started the trip on a cold Monday morning in late September. The air was dry, crisp, and still. I had been planning this hike for weeks. I had found an old blog post from years ago about a place called Elkhead Pass, way up in a lesser-used section of a national forest in Colorado. It wasn't one of those tourist-heavy areas. In fact, I had to really dig to find a trail map for it, and I could tell from satellite images that not many people used it. That's exactly what I wanted. I needed to be away from people, from work stress, and from the sound of phones buzzing every 5 minutes. I packed everything I thought I would need: 2 days worth of food, extra layers, a tent, a first aid kit, my GPS, compass, trail maps, and my solar charger for emergencies. I had bear spray on me too, which I never usually brought, but something about this trail made me feel like I should be more careful. Maybe it was just the remoteness of it. The drive to the trailhead took 4 hours, and by the time I got there, the wind had picked up. There were no cars in the parking area, not one. I stepped out, stretched my legs, and took in the view. The sky was a sharp blue, with long fingers of clouds stretching low across the ridgelines. The mountains looked quiet, silent, the kind of silent that makes you feel like the last person on earth. I slung on my pack, locked my car, and started up the trail. The first few miles were peaceful. My boots crunched along dry dirt and small pebbles. Trees stood tall and silent on both sides. I passed 2 creeks, one barely flowing and the other ice cold and fast. I stopped to fill my bottle and kept moving. There were old trail markers on the trees, faded blue paint, but they were spaced far apart. Sometimes I had to stop and backtrack a little to stay on the path. Around mile 6, the terrain got steeper. Rocky switchbacks twisted up the side of a ridge. I started seeing less pine and more open ground, patches of dried grass, and windswept stones. I rested on a flat rock and looked out over the valley below. No houses, no sounds, just wind and the occasional rustling of dry branches. I kept going. The sun was sinking low by the time I made camp. I found a small flat patch between 2 tall rocks that helped block some of the wind. I pitched the tent, ate a cold protein bar, and watched the stars start to show. No moon that night, just the stars, more than I'd seen in years, and that deep dark sky. I didn't sleep much. Something about the place made me uneasy. There wasn't a single sound except for the wind, and even that seemed to stop at times, like the forest was holding its breath. The next morning, I kept moving, hoping to reach Elkhead Pass by noon. The trail was barely visible in some areas. I had to rely on the map and compass more than I liked. There were no signs of people, no footprints, no trash, nothing. It felt like I was walking through a place that had been forgotten. Around mid-morning, I heard something strange. It was faint, like metal scraping against rock. It came from somewhere above me. I froze and scanned the slope. Nothing moved. I thought maybe a falling rock or something shifting in the wind. But then I heard it again, louder, like metal on metal. I stood still for a long minute, heart thudding hard. But the sound didn't repeat. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I reached the pass just before noon. It was a wide, flat space between 2 massive peaks. The wind was stronger there, howling low and steady like a distant engine. I looked around for a place to rest and found a rocky outcrop. I sat, drank water, and pulled out a granola bar. That's when I noticed the tracks. They weren't animal tracks. They looked like boot prints, fresh. The tread was clear. I hadn't passed anyone. I hadn't seen another car. But these tracks came from the north side of the pass and led off to the west, down into a narrow ravine that wasn't on any of my maps. I stared at them for a while. Something felt off. They weren't spaced like someone hiking. They were too far apart, like someone running or at least walking quickly. And they weren't going up the pass, they were going down, away, as if someone had turned around in a hurry. I followed them for maybe 20 yards. Then I stopped. They just ended. The ground there was dry and rocky, so maybe I just lost the trail. But it felt sudden, like the person had vanished. I stood still, scanning the area. No movement, no sound except the wind. I felt something then. Not fear exactly, more like pressure, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I turned back. I started down the trail I had come up, thinking I'd camp at the same spot as the night before. It was early, but I didn't care. Something about that pass, those tracks. I didn't want to stay any longer than I had to. About halfway down, I noticed something strange. A cairn, a stack of rocks, had been built beside the trail. It hadn't been there the day before. It was fresh. The rocks were clean, no moss or dirt. They looked like they'd been taken from the trail itself, balanced in a narrow pyramid. That part of the trail wasn't hard to follow. There was no reason for anyone to build a marker there, and I hadn't seen any sign of another hiker. I kept walking. I reached my previous campsite late in the afternoon. I didn't stop. I had a strong urge to keep going, to get lower down the mountain. I didn't want to sleep up there again. I figured I could hike until sunset and find a new spot closer to the trailhead. The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched across the trail. The air turned colder. Then I heard it again. Metal scraping. This time it was behind me. I turned fast, heart pounding. The trail was empty. Rocks, trees, wind. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I picked up my pace. Then I noticed the second cairn. This one was bigger, 5 or 6 feet off the trail, tucked into a small gap between two boulders. Same style, rocks stacked with care, freshly placed. My chest tightened. I moved past it fast, refusing to look back. The sun dropped behind the ridge, and the forest darkened fast. I pulled out my headlamp and kept going. My legs burned. My breath came sharp. I passed another switchback, and then I saw it, another cairn. This one right in the middle of the trail. I stopped. This wasn't normal. Someone was placing these, watching, keeping track of me, maybe. I stepped around the rocks and moved on, faster now. The air was colder, and the wind had picked up. It was a hard, steady wind that carried no sound except itself. I passed 2 more cairns before I found a place to stop. I didn't pitch the tent. I just laid out my sleeping bag behind a thick log and tried to stay low, hidden. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just laid there in the dark, listening. All night I heard movement, rocks shifting, sticks breaking, not loud, just enough to keep me awake. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke just before dawn. My body was stiff, my mouth dry, but I didn't waste time. I packed up and started walking again, light barely breaking over the trees. I was maybe 3 miles from the trailhead when I saw the last cairn. It was different. This one wasn't made of rocks. It was made of bones. Small animal bones, ribs, femurs, tiny skulls, stacked in a loose pyramid right beside the trail. Some of them were wired together with rusted string or thin metal. Something stuck out from the top. A broken knife handle bent at the end. I didn't stop to look closer. I just kept moving. I reached the trailhead just before noon. My car was the only one there. I unlocked it with shaking hands and got inside. My heart was still thudding as I drove down the winding road, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't feel safe until I hit pavement. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 2 towns over. I sat there for a long time, engine running, hands gripping the wheel. I thought about reporting it. The bones, the cairns, the sounds. But what would I say? That someone built piles of rocks? That I heard noises? I just drove home. I didn't unpack for 2 days. When I finally went through my pack, I found something that didn't belong. A rock, smooth, flat, pale gray. It sat at the bottom of the pack under my clothes. I hadn't picked it up. I would have remembered. I threw it away, but I couldn't sleep that night, and I haven't been hiking since. Something was up there. Maybe just a person. Maybe someone hiding out, watching the trail. But it wasn't random. It wasn't just a hiker. The bones, the noises, the sudden vanishing tracks, and the things I didn't put in my pack. Someone was trying to be noticed, or send a message. I still have the trail maps, still have the GPS logs, but I've never opened them again. Because every time I think about that pass, that wind, that silence, I remember the way it felt, like I was being followed, not hunted, not chased, just watched. And for me, that's worse. It was a Friday morning. and I found myself standing at the entrance of a hiking trail deep in the woods. I had never been to this particular spot before, but the moment I stepped onto the gravel path, I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. Maybe it was the unknown of the trail or the fact that I was hiking alone. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trail itself was narrow, winding its way through a dense forest of tall pines. Their branches swayed gently in the breeze, but there was no sign of wildlife. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves. The air felt thick, as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I told myself it was just my imagination, but that strange sense of unease followed me, lingering like a shadow. I had prepared for the hike the night before, packing my bag with the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map, and a flashlight. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with the sun shining through the gaps in the trees. The forecast had predicted clear skies, so I wasn't concerned about getting lost or running into bad weather. But there was something in the air, something I couldn't put my finger on. I walked for about an hour, the soft crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound I could hear. As I went deeper into the woods, the trail became less defined, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I had been following a small creek for the last few minutes, and the sound of water rushing over rocks was a welcome change to the silence. It was peaceful, but the peacefulness was unsettling. The forest felt empty, like it was hiding something. I pulled out my map to make sure I was still on track. The trail was supposed to loop around a small lake about 3 miles in. I had seen a few other hikers on the way in, but by now I hadn't seen anyone for the past hour. It was a little strange, but I figured they had just taken different paths or maybe turned back. As I walked, I began to notice small details I hadn't seen before. The ground was a little more uneven. The trees were growing closer together, their trunks twisted and gnarled. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it kept creeping back, no matter how many times I told myself it was nothing. About halfway through the hike, I came to a small clearing. The sunlight filtered through the trees in shafts, and I could hear the distant sound of birds again. It was a small moment of comfort, but it didn't last long. As I stood there, taking in the surroundings, I noticed something odd. A tree on the edge of the clearing had markings on it. Scratches that looked like claw marks, deep and jagged, as if something had tried to claw its way up the trunk. I studied the marks for a moment, my heart starting to race. They were recent, there was no mistaking it. I stepped closer, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The scratches weren't random. They were deliberate, as if whatever made them had been trying to get at something higher in the tree. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made any sense. Maybe an animal had done it, I thought. Bears or mountain lions could easily scratch trees to mark their territory. But something didn't sit right with me. I scanned the area around the tree, but there was no sign of any animal tracks in the dirt, just my own footprints. Shaking my head, I decided to move on. I had already come this far, and I wasn't going to let a few strange marks ruin my hike. But as I turned to continue down the trail, I felt a chill crawl down my spine. The air had shifted. It wasn't colder, but it felt heavier, as if the atmosphere had changed somehow. The trail became steeper as I pressed on, the ground now covered in thick layers of fallen pine needles and damp moss. I had to concentrate more with each step to avoid slipping. As I rounded a corner, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a pile of rocks, perfectly stacked, arranged in a way that didn't seem natural. They were too orderly, too precise. Someone had taken the time to carefully place them, one on top of the other, forming a small tower about 5 feet tall. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't seen anything like this on the map. There were no mentions of strange markers or landmarks along the trail. I looked around again, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. There was no sign of anyone else. I had seen other hikers at the beginning, but now the forest felt even emptier. The towering rocks seemed out of place, standing like an unnatural monument in the middle of nowhere. It felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. After a few more seconds of staring, I slowly took a step back, my eyes still fixed on the strange structure. Something about it made me want to turn around, to walk back the way I came, but I pushed the thought away. It was probably just some oddity in the woods, nature's way of playing tricks on you. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. I continued down the trail, keeping a brisk pace now. The farther I went, the more the path seemed to narrow. The trees were so thick that they blocked out most of the sunlight, casting long shadows that made it feel like dusk, even though it was only mid-afternoon. After a few more miles, I reached the edge of the lake. It wasn't as picturesque as I had hoped. The water was still, reflecting the trees and the sky in a perfect mirror. But there was something about it that made me uneasy. I set my backpack down by the shore, thinking I would take a break and have some water, but I couldn't sit still. I paced along the water's edge, trying to shake the odd feeling that had settled deep in my gut. Then I saw it. Across the lake, on the opposite shore, I spotted a figure standing among the trees. It was tall, humanoid in shape, but there was something off about it. It wasn't moving, just standing still, almost like it was watching me. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the figure. For a moment, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but no, there was someone or something over there. I froze, trying to figure out what to do. Should I shout? Should I try to get closer? But I wasn't sure I wanted to. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to get away from the lake and the figure across the water. The longer I looked, the more the figure seemed to blend into the trees, almost as if it was part of the forest itself. I turned away quickly, grabbing my pack and heading back the way I came. I didn't know if the figure was real or just my imagination running wild, but the feeling that something was wrong weighed heavily on me. The trail felt longer now, and every step felt like it was leading me farther into an unknown place. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake the image of the figure standing by the water. It felt like I was being followed, though I never heard any footsteps behind me. The stillness of the forest was deafening. The only sound now the rustle of leaves underfoot. By the time I reached the strange rock pile again, I was in a full-on panic. I had never been more relieved to see a familiar landmark. I had to keep moving to get out of the forest to find safety, but I didn't dare stop to examine the rocks again. I kept my eyes forward, barely glancing to the side. It took another hour of walking before I finally saw the trailhead again. The feeling of dread still hadn't left me, but I was almost out. When I stepped out into the open field where the parking lot was, I couldn't believe I had made it. I didn't look back as I walked to my car. I just wanted to get away, to drive somewhere far from this place. The strange feeling stayed with me the whole drive home, gnawing at the back of my mind. I wasn't sure if it was the forest itself that had unsettled me, or if I had just imagined the whole thing. Either way, I wasn't going back to that trail anytime soon. In the end, I couldn't shake the thought that something was out there, something watching me from the trees. Whether it was just my mind playing tricks or something more sinister, I may never know. But one thing was clear: I had no intention of returning to that trail. Not ever. I had never planned on hiking that day. It wasn't something I'd done much, not with any regularity. But the weather was clear, and I was tired of being cooped up indoors. I needed a break. I needed the air. So, I packed my backpack with a bottle of water, some trail mix, a first aid kit, and my trusty old map. No cell phone service up there, just the kind of escape I was looking for. I chose a trail that wasn't too far from where I lived, one that was moderately difficult but not too long, just enough to clear my head. The trailhead was at the foot of a mountain, its rocky outcrop looming in the distance like a beast waiting to be tamed. As I stepped onto the path, I could hear the crunch of my boots against the earth, the sound of the occasional rustle in the trees, and the hum of insects busy in the summer warmth. The first few miles went smoothly. The trail wound through tall pines and sparse underbrush. Sunlight filtered through the trees in speckled patches, and the air smelled like pine needles, damp soil, and fresh leaves. It was peaceful, far more peaceful than I'd expected. The hike was an easy, steady incline, and I quickly found myself immersed in the rhythm of putting one foot in front of the other. Time seemed to slow down as I climbed. I passed a few other hikers on the way up, mostly couples and families who waved hello or smiled as they passed. Everyone seemed friendly, relaxed. One hiker, a man probably in his 40s, nodded at me with a small smile as I stopped to drink some water. He had a weathered face, like someone who had spent more than a few years in the outdoors. His boots were caked in mud, his backpack looked heavy. He said something about the trail getting steeper farther up, but I didn't think much of it. I was still feeling pretty good, but that was before the weather started to change. About 2 hours into the hike, the sky, which had been so clear when I set out, began to darken. The wind picked up, too, kicking through the trees with a sharpness I hadn't noticed before. I glanced around, noticing that the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the trail. My thoughts turned to the weather forecast I had seen earlier. Clear skies, no rain. I cursed myself for not bringing a jacket, but I wasn't about to turn back now. I had come this far. As I continued upwards, the terrain began to get rougher. The path narrowed, and the incline steepened. I found myself having to pay more attention to where I was stepping, the rocks becoming larger, the roots from the trees snaking out in all directions like a maze. I had to use my hands a couple of times to help me scramble over a particularly steep part. The trail was becoming more isolated now, too. I hadn't seen another hiker in over half an hour. The storm, if that's what it was going to be, seemed to be drawing closer. The wind howled through the trees, and the first drops of rain hit the back of my neck. The trees swayed violently, their leaves rattling and rustling, but the canopy above offered some shelter. Still, the rain started coming harder, and soon enough, I was completely soaked, my clothes sticking to my skin. But I wasn't going back. Not yet. I reached a fork in the trail. 2 paths diverged, each leading into a part of the mountain that seemed equally desolate. I checked the map, but the weather had turned the pages of my map into a soggy mess, and I could barely make out the trail markers. One path seemed to veer slightly more uphill, while the other twisted around the side of a ridge. I couldn't remember which one was supposed to be the more direct route to the summit, but I picked the one that felt like it would take me higher. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. The further I climbed, the worse the weather became. By the time I made it past the next section of trees, the rain had turned into a full-blown storm, and the wind was blowing harder than I thought possible. The trail had become a muddy mess, the ground uneven and treacherous. Every step felt like a gamble, and I started to get the sense that I was no longer just hiking. I was fighting against the mountain itself. I stumbled over rocks, my boots slipping in the mud, and I could feel the storm, the cold, cutting through my clothes. I tried to keep my focus on the trail, but the darkness was growing. The cloud cover was so thick now that it felt like twilight, even though it was only mid-afternoon. I couldn't see very far ahead, and it felt as if the storm was swallowing everything. Then I heard it. At first, it was faint, just a distant sound, like a low growl coming from far away, but it quickly grew louder. A rumble of thunder, but it wasn't like any thunder I'd heard before. This was different, more violent, deep, as though the mountain itself was groaning. My heart skipped. I wasn't sure if it was thunder or something else, but the hair on my neck stood up. I quickened my pace, not looking back, the only sound the rush of my breath and the squelch of my feet in the mud. I had no idea how much time passed. Maybe it was an hour, maybe 2. The wind and rain were relentless. I was wet, cold, and my muscles were beginning to burn. I was starting to wonder if I had taken the wrong path. The summit had to be close, but the trail didn't seem to be getting any easier. Finally, I reached a ridge, and I stopped to catch my breath. I had no idea where I was anymore. There were no landmarks, no signs, just the pounding rain and the howling wind. My map was useless, and my phone had no service. I had no way of knowing where I was or how far I had to go to reach the summit. All I knew was that I was alone, wet, and beginning to lose my grip on the situation. But as I stood there, catching my breath, I saw something. Through the trees, I noticed a faint flicker of light, a small orange glow that seemed out of place in the storm. My heart skipped. Someone else? A fellow hiker, maybe? A sign of civilization? I immediately started moving toward it, hoping it was a ranger station or a shelter, something that could offer me some respite from the storm. The ground was slick beneath my boots, and I had to be careful not to slip as I made my way toward the light. The rain had become a downpour, and the wind was picking up speed, pushing against me with each step. As I got closer to the light, I noticed it wasn't just a light. It was a campfire, and the fire was surrounded by a makeshift shelter, a tarp stretched between the trees. I didn't care about the details. I was just grateful to see someone, to know that I wasn't completely alone in this wild, unforgiving place. I approached the campfire cautiously, calling out to whoever might be there, but there was no answer. As I got closer, I realized the fire was almost out. The flames flickered weakly, and I could barely see anyone around it. My heart sank as I scanned the area. The shelter was empty. There was no one there. The fire was barely enough to cast a shadow now. I stepped forward to try and add some wood to the fire, but as I bent down, my stomach twisted. Something was wrong. There, on the ground, lying in the mud next to the fire, was a backpack. The same kind of backpack I had, standard, worn-in, something you take on a trail like this. I reached out for it, hesitated, and then pulled it closer. Inside, I found a water bottle, a few granola bars, a pair of gloves, and a first aid kit. Nothing unusual except for the fact that there was no sign of anyone who owned the pack. No sign of the hiker who had set up this fire. There were no tracks in the mud leading away from the fire, no trail to follow. I stood up quickly, suddenly aware of the weight of the silence surrounding me. It was as though the mountain had swallowed the person who had been here. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. The storm was still raging, but everything felt eerily quiet now. Too quiet. With my heart pounding, I turned back toward the trail, not caring about the fire anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My instincts told me to leave, to get away from this place as quickly as I could. So I did. I retraced my steps, moving quickly, trying to make my way back down the trail. The storm had finally let up a little, but I could still hear the distant rumble of thunder as I moved. The hike down felt different. It was as if the mountain had changed, as though the very earth beneath me was shifting. Every step I took felt heavier, more deliberate. The weight of the unknown pressed on me. By the time I reached the trailhead again, it was nearly dark. I had been gone for hours longer than I had expected. My legs ached, and my clothes were soaked through. I didn't look back as I reached my car and slammed the door shut, my breath still coming in sharp, ragged bursts. The storm had passed, but the unease hadn't left me. The mountain was quiet now, but I knew it wouldn't be the same again. I never went back. I've always loved hiking, but I've never been one for long, remote trails. The thought of getting lost or being too far from help makes my stomach twist. This hike, though, was supposed to be different. I picked a trail that was supposed to be easy, not too far out and well-traversed. It wasn't supposed to challenge me, but instead, offer a peaceful day in nature. I'd been preparing for it for days, checking my gear, packing food, filling my water bottle. Everything seemed fine. I even made sure my phone was fully charged, just in case I needed it. The trailhead was about an hour from home, tucked into a quiet part of the forest that I knew well enough to feel comfortable. It was early morning when I arrived, the sun just starting to climb into the sky. I didn't want to wait until it got too hot, so I set off immediately. The air had that crisp, fresh smell that only comes with mornings in the woods, and the sound of birds chirping was the only noise around me. It was perfect. The first few miles were exactly what I expected, easy, smooth, with the occasional incline to get my blood flowing. I passed a couple of other hikers, nodded in greeting, but mostly, I was alone. The solitude felt good. I felt connected to something bigger than myself, and the worries of daily life melted away with each step I took. But something strange happened about 3 miles in. The path, which had been well marked with bright trail signs, suddenly seemed to fade into a series of rougher, less defined tracks. I wasn't far from where I'd parked my car, so I thought it was probably just an offshoot of the main trail. No big deal. I kept moving forward, telling myself that I could always turn back if it didn't feel right. The further I went, the more overgrown the path became. The trail markers were harder to spot, and the brush was thicker, with branches scraping against my arms and legs. But still, I pressed on. My instincts had never let me down before, and I wasn't about to let a few brambles scare me off. I told myself it was just nature, getting wilder as I ventured deeper into the woods. Then came the silence. At first, I didn't notice it. I was too focused on the tangled branches and roots underfoot. But as I paused for a second to catch my breath, I realized the sounds of birds and rustling leaves had stopped. It was as if the forest had suddenly gone still, holding its breath. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off. After all, nature can be quiet sometimes, right? I kept walking, and as the trail seemed to disappear into more dense underbrush, I felt a growing unease. The air had turned thick, heavy, almost humid, though there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Sweat began to form on the back of my neck, and my heart rate quickened, though I couldn't figure out why. There was no reason for it, not really. I'd been on plenty of hikes before, and nothing was wrong. The trail wasn't that bad. But the deeper I went, the more it felt like I was being pulled into something I wasn't meant to be a part of. I checked my watch. 2 hours had passed since I left the trailhead. No one had passed me, and I hadn't passed anyone else. The path ahead of me seemed to narrow, the trees growing closer together, their branches arching overhead to form a canopy. The sun filtered through the gaps in the leaves, but it wasn't as bright anymore. The shadows felt longer than they should have. Something wasn't right, and I knew it, but I didn't want to admit it. I'd come this far. I couldn't turn back yet. Maybe if I pushed just a little farther, I'd find my bearings again. That's when I saw it. A figure, no, a shadow, darted across the path ahead. It was too fast to make out clearly, but I froze. My breath caught in my chest. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, nothing at all. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer or a large bird. But something about the way it moved, the speed, the direction, felt off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was waiting for me just beyond the tree line. I kept walking, but now my senses were on high alert. The air felt heavier, thicker. The forest around me felt more suffocating than peaceful. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush, made me jump. I didn't know if it was my imagination, but I thought I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate behind me. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the paranoia off. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. But then, just as I was about to break into a light jog, I heard it. A low, grating noise, like a twig being snapped under a boot. I stopped dead in my tracks. There was someone behind me. Someone or something was out there. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. No hikers, no animals, nothing. Then I heard it again, closer this time. My heart raced in my chest as I turned quickly, half expecting to see someone standing just behind me. But there was nothing. The trail was empty. I was alone. A sense of dread washed over me as I stood there, motionless, listening. The sounds of the forest were gone. There were no birds, no insects, no rustling of leaves. Just silence. I knew I should turn around. I knew I should go back the way I came, but the fear that gripped me kept my feet planted where they were. I felt trapped, like something was keeping me here, and I couldn't move. It wasn't just the fear of being lost. It was something deeper, something primal, like the forest itself was warning me to leave. I finally snapped myself out of it and took a few cautious steps forward, my breath shallow. I needed to keep moving. I didn't know why, but I couldn't stay in one place. I glanced over my shoulder once more, half expecting to see a figure looming behind me, but there was nothing. The woods remained still. I pressed on, my pace faster now. I needed to get to the end of this trail. The path had grown even narrower, the trees closing in, blocking the sun. It felt like the forest was swallowing me whole, like it was trying to keep me here. But the more I walked, the less I recognized where I was. Minutes turned to hours as I trudged through the overgrown path, sweat pouring down my back and legs aching. The air had grown damp and colder, and I felt a shiver creep down my spine. My phone had no signal, and I had no idea how far I'd gone. The trail was no longer recognizable, and I had no sense of direction. The woods seemed endless, but just as I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it, a break in the trees. The trail widened, and ahead of me was a clearing. It wasn't the end of the trail, but it was a glimpse of something more open, something that gave me hope. I sprinted toward it, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. When I emerged into the clearing, I stopped in my tracks. There, standing in the middle of the clearing, was a large wooden structure. It wasn't a cabin, not really, but a dilapidated shack, abandoned and covered in moss, with parts of the roof caved in. I didn't know how I hadn't noticed it earlier, but there it was. I approached it cautiously, unsure of what to expect. I circled the shack, my mind racing. There was no one here, no signs of life, but something about the place felt wrong. It felt like someone had been there recently. The air around the shack felt heavier, and the shadows seemed darker than they should be. I didn't want to go inside. Something told me to turn around and get back to the trail, but I needed to be sure. I was lost, and the only way out was to figure out where I was. So I made my way inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the smell of mold and decay hit me instantly. The floor was covered in dirt, and broken furniture lay in heaps. There was no sign of anyone having lived here for years, but the feeling of being watched remained. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to leave, but that's when I heard it. A crackling sound, like firewood breaking under pressure, and then a soft thud. I froze. I wasn't alone. With every ounce of strength I had left, I ran. The forest seemed endless, but this time the path was clearer. I ran and ran until I finally broke free of the trees and stumbled onto a familiar trail. And then the trailhead. My car was in sight. I didn't look back. I don't know what was out there in those woods. I don't know who or what I heard in that shack, but I'll never go back to that place. The forest didn't want me there, and whatever it was that had been following me, it didn't want me to leave. I was lucky to get out, but I'll never forget the way it felt. Alone, trapped, with something watching, waiting, and I'll never go on a hike like that again. I had always loved the idea of hiking. The peace, the quiet, the disconnect from everything. It was something I needed, especially after a few stressful months. Work had been demanding, and my relationships had been strained. I needed a break. So, I planned a solo hiking trip through one of the trails up in the mountains. I didn't tell many people about it. It wasn't that I was worried or anything. It was more that I just wanted to be by myself, clear my head. The trail I chose was one of those lesser-known ones. It wasn't on the big maps, and it didn't get the tourist traffic. I liked that about it. It felt like a place where I could really be alone. The weather forecast was perfect, no rain, clear skies, and temperatures in the mid-60s. Exactly what I needed. I set off early in the morning. The air was crisp, the kind of coolness that made you feel awake and alert. I had my gear all packed: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map of the area, a compass, and my phone in case of emergency. I knew the basics. I'd been hiking enough times to be comfortable with it. I wasn't an expert, but I wasn't a total beginner either. The first few miles went smoothly. The trail wasn't too steep, and the views were stunning. Trees surrounded me, their leaves rustling in the light breeze. Birds chirped in the distance, and I could hear the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The trail twisted and turned, and I noticed the further I went, the less I could hear the sounds of civilization. It was strange, peaceful, sure, but it started to feel almost too quiet. But I shook it off. I was just being paranoid, I thought. The kind of quiet you only get when you're deep in the woods. The kind of quiet you go to the forest to find. Hours passed as I hiked on, and I found myself getting further and further from the trailhead. I had been hiking for about 4 hours when I came across a fork in the trail. There was no sign, no markings, nothing. I paused for a moment, trying to recall the map in my head. One path seemed a bit more worn than the other, and my instincts told me to take that one. Maybe I had missed the sign, or maybe it wasn't marked at all. Either way, I was here for an adventure. I took the left trail, hoping it would loop me back to the main route eventually. It was still a good path, at least it seemed that way. But as I continued, the trees grew denser, and the trail narrowed. The air started to feel thick, almost heavy, like the weight of the trees above me was pressing in. The ground beneath my boots was soft and muddy, and I had to be careful where I stepped. There weren't as many signs of wildlife now. No more birds, no more rustling in the underbrush. It felt like something was missing, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I took a break near a small creek that I had stumbled upon. It wasn't much, just a few rocks to sit on while I drank some water. The sound of the creek was soothing. For a moment, I let myself relax. The hike had been tiring, but in a good way. The fresh air was clearing my head. I thought about how good it would feel to reach the summit, to stand there and look out at the vast expanse of the valley below. But then I noticed something strange. The creek was running unnaturally fast for the area. The water was churning, moving in a way that didn't quite fit with the rest of the environment. It wasn't like there had been a recent storm, but the water seemed off. I stood up and moved a little closer, trying to get a better look. The creek wasn't as solid as it should have been either, almost like the ground underneath it had shifted. My unease grew. Something about the place felt wrong. I wasn't scared, at least not in the way you might think, but there was an underlying tension. It was like my body knew something wasn't right, but my mind was slow to catch up. I tried to shake it off and continue. The trail ahead was barely a path anymore, just a faint line through thick brush. I pushed on, each step more difficult than the last. The trees seemed to crowd closer, their branches tangled together like a net above me. The silence felt oppressive now. No birds, no animals, no sounds of life at all. I wasn't sure what was happening, but it was starting to unsettle me. It must have been around 3 p.m. when things started to feel off. The shadows were stretching longer than they should, and the sunlight felt dim, even though it was still early afternoon. I tried to push through it, but it was as if I was walking through a different time, a place that was stuck in a moment. I reached another clearing, but this one was different. The air felt dense, as though something was hanging in it. I stopped dead in my tracks. The path ahead seemed to disappear into an unbroken sea of trees. I looked back the way I came. No trail, no markers, nothing that felt familiar. My stomach dropped. I knew I had followed the right path, but this didn't look like the way back. I felt a knot tightening in my chest. Panic started creeping in. I had been lost before, but never in a place like this. I pulled out my map and compass, but they didn't help. The map didn't seem to match the terrain anymore, and the compass needle spun wildly, as if it was being influenced by something I couldn't see. I stood there, frozen. The overwhelming quiet had shifted into something more sinister. It wasn't just the silence. It was the absence of any movement at all. No wind, no rustling leaves, no birds. It was as though everything around me was holding its breath. My heart began to race. I decided to retrace my steps, hoping to find something familiar. But no matter which way I turned, the trail kept leading me further into the trees. It felt like the forest was closing in on me, pushing me deeper, cutting off my escape. Nightfall was approaching quickly now, and I had no choice but to keep moving. I pulled out my flashlight, even though the sun was still up. It was getting harder to see, and the dense trees blocked out much of the light. I had no idea how much time had passed. I stopped checking my watch, too scared to focus on anything other than moving forward. Eventually, I found myself stumbling onto a small, clearing-like area. There was no path, but the ground was soft, and I could finally see the sky through a break in the trees. I decided to stop there for the night, hoping that when daylight came, I could figure out my way back. I set up camp quickly. No fire. I didn't want to risk drawing attention to myself. As I sat there in the stillness of the darkening forest, I could hear faint sounds, whispers, maybe? I wasn't sure. The trees seemed to move, but there was no wind. It was as though they were shifting in place, growing larger and more oppressive with each passing minute. That night was a blur of tension. I tried to sleep, but every noise sent me sitting up in my tent, wide awake. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was drifting too far from safety. I kept the flashlight on, hoping it would offer some reassurance, but the shadows seemed to multiply as the night wore on. When morning finally came, I packed up as quickly as I could. The sun was barely rising, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what else this forest had in store. As I made my way back, I wasn't sure if I was heading in the right direction, but something inside me told me to keep going. And then, as if the forest itself had given me a chance, I saw it, the familiar fork in the trail, the one I had passed hours ago. Relief flooded through me. I wasn't lost anymore. I made my way back to the trailhead, the fresh morning air filling my lungs. The world felt different now, quieter, but in a good way. I had faced something out there, something unsettling, but I made it through. I drove home that day, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. The forest had tested me, but I had made it through. There was something about that place, something that had left me rattled, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was understanding. I would go back to that trail one day when I was ready, but next time I would be smarter. I would listen to the land a little more carefully, feel the weight of it beneath my feet, and know when to trust it. For now, though, I was just happy to be home. I never thought hiking would end up as something I'd regret, but that day changed everything. It started out simple enough. The weather was perfect, clear skies, cool breeze, and the kind of crisp air that felt refreshing with every breath. It was early spring, so the trees hadn't fully come to life yet, but the first buds were beginning to appear. I had just moved into the area a few weeks prior, and when I saw the trailhead sign just outside the small town, I figured it was as good a place as any to spend my afternoon. The trail was labeled as moderate, a mix of uphill sections with some flat areas to catch your breath. It wasn't the most popular hiking route, but I preferred it that way. Promised solitude, and I was craving that quiet escape. I packed my backpack with water, snacks, and a first aid kit, just the basics. I wasn't worried about anything happening. I had hiked before. I knew the rules. Stay hydrated, pace yourself, and always keep an eye on the time. But this time, it felt different. From the moment I stepped onto the trail, something was off. I couldn't place it, but there was a weight in the air, like something pressing down on my chest, something almost unexplainable. The first mile was easy. The trail wound through some light woods with soft earth beneath my boots. Birds were chirping, and the occasional rustle of leaves added a peaceful background noise. I passed a few other hikers, but the closer I got to the halfway point, the fewer I saw. It was just me, the trail, and the sound of my footsteps. I stopped at a small clearing where I could hear the soft gurgling of a stream in the distance. It was tempting to get closer, but I decided against it. I had read online that the trail could get treacherous, especially if you weren't paying attention, and I didn't want to risk slipping into the creek. The last thing I needed was to end up soaked, miles from the nearest road. As I resumed my hike, I noticed that the trail began to climb more steeply. The trees thinned out, replaced by rocks and scraggly bushes that had grown in the spaces between the boulders. The path twisted and turned, and every time I looked up, the peaks seemed to get further away. My breathing became heavier, my legs began to burn, and my mind wandered back to the hike I'd taken last summer. I had completed a much harder trail then, but something about this one felt different. It was harder not because of the elevation, but because of the sheer isolation. When I finally reached a higher point, the view was incredible. The valley below looked peaceful, dotted with farms and small houses. The mountains in the distance seemed endless, stretching beyond what the eye could see. It was a beautiful sight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was more than just the quiet. There was an odd presence, a subtle sense of being watched. I shrugged it off as my mind playing tricks. Everyone gets a little paranoid when they're out on their own, I thought. I took a long drink from my water bottle and pushed on. It wasn't long before the trail became more rugged. Loose rocks jutted out from the earth, and I had to be careful with each step. The air was thinner here, and my legs felt heavy, almost leaden. I had crossed into the more mountainous part of the hike, and I was starting to feel the toll it was taking on my body. The way up was steep, and it seemed to go on forever. There were times when I wondered if I should turn around and head back. But then I'd think about the view from the top and push myself to go just a little further. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the path. I figured I had a few more hours of daylight, but I was starting to feel the pressure of time. I had to make it to the summit before it got dark, or I would have a hard time getting back down. As I moved forward, the trail began to narrow, and the drop-offs on either side grew steeper. One wrong step, and I'd find myself tumbling down the hillside. I slowed down, carefully picking my way over the uneven ground. Then, just as I was taking another cautious step forward, I heard something. It was faint at first, just the sound of something cracking. A branch breaking? I wasn't sure, but it was enough to make me stop. I held my breath, straining my ears to hear more. I turned my head, scanning the area around me. There was nothing, just trees and rocks. I told myself I was being paranoid again. Maybe a rock had shifted or an animal had moved nearby. But then the sound came again, this time much louder, like footsteps. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. Could have been another hiker. I rationalized it, but my gut told me otherwise. The feeling of being watched intensified. I had to shake it off. I didn't want to scare myself into turning back. But every few steps, I'd hear it again. Footsteps, not in rhythm with mine, but off, almost as if someone or something was following me, mimicking my movements. I kept going, my pace quickening, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The trail twisted up ahead, and I told myself that if I could just make it around the bend, I'd have a clearer view and maybe figure out what was going on. As I rounded the corner, the path widened slightly, and I stopped, taking in the view. My breath was coming in shallow bursts now, and I wiped the sweat from my forehead, unsure of what to do next. I wanted to be rational, but my instincts told me to leave. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A figure standing just off the trail, hidden among the trees. It was tall, motionless, and just there. My pulse raced as my brain tried to process what I was seeing. It wasn't another hiker. No one else was supposed to be up here. The figure didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, staring at me, or at least I felt like it was staring. I took a step back, my boots scraping against the rocky surface. I was suddenly overwhelmed by the need to get out of there. The quiet that had seemed peaceful earlier now felt suffocating. The weight on my chest became unbearable, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I didn't want to be there anymore. Whatever that figure was, whoever it was, I couldn't stay. I turned around quickly and started heading back down the trail, not looking back. My steps were hurried, my heart racing. I focused only on the path beneath my feet, ignoring the feeling of eyes on my back. As I descended, the noise that had followed me earlier started up again. Faint at first, but growing louder with every step. Footsteps, closer this time, as if someone was following me down the trail. I picked up the pace, then broke into a run, the adrenaline pushing me forward. My legs burned, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away from whatever was behind me. The path seemed to stretch out endlessly, but I finally reached the point where the trail split. I veered off to the left, following a smaller path that led to a clearing. I needed to get my bearings. When I emerged from the woods, I saw the trailhead sign in the distance. I didn't stop running until I reached it, my breath ragged, my chest heaving. I looked over my shoulder once, twice, but the path was empty. I stood there, hands on my knees, trying to calm myself. I had made it. I was safe. It wasn't until I got home and started reflecting on everything that happened that the strange sense of unease finally started to dissipate. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe I had been too isolated for too long. But the one thing that was clear was this: I had learned a valuable lesson. Never take nature's quiet for granted. What I had once thought of as a peaceful escape had turned into something far more ominous. I wouldn't be heading back to that trail again anytime soon. And if I did, I'd make sure I wasn't alone. It was supposed to be a normal hike, just me and the trail far away from everything. No distractions, no noise, just the sounds of the forest and the crunch of dirt beneath my boots. But it turned into something else entirely, something I'll never forget. I started early that morning, the air crisp and fresh, the kind of morning where you could almost taste the peace. I had decided to go on a trail I'd heard about but never tried. It wasn't the most popular, which was exactly what I wanted. The less crowded, the better. I didn't want anyone else around, just the solitude of the forest and the satisfaction of pushing myself. The trail I was going to was called the Ridgeline. It was a few miles long, winding through dense forest and occasionally opening up to views of the valley below. I knew it would take a few hours, but I wasn't concerned. I had plenty of water, snacks, and my phone in case I needed it for the trail map or an emergency. The first part of the hike was easy. The path was well marked and smooth, with only a slight incline. I could hear the chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, the kind of sounds that make you realize how disconnected you are from the noise of everyday life. The forest around me was dense, tall pines towering overhead, blocking out the sun in some places. There was a coolness to the air, even though the sun was rising higher. It felt good to be out here, away from people, away from everything. The path wasn't too narrow, but it wasn't wide either. It was just the right size for a single person, maybe two if they didn't mind being close. As I moved further along the trail, the air began to shift. The breeze picked up, and the forest became quieter, almost too quiet. The birds stopped singing, and the usual rustling of leaves seemed to fade away. It wasn't that eerie silence you hear in movies, but something felt off. The trees around me were getting taller, their trunks thicker, and the trail was becoming less defined. In places, I had to step carefully to avoid tripping over roots or slipping on loose rocks. But I didn't mind. This was part of the challenge. I pressed on, pushing myself further into the wilderness. My steps began to feel heavier, not because I was tired, but because the air around me seemed to grow thicker. It was hard to explain, but something didn't feel right. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I looked around, but there was nothing unusual, just the same old trees, the same dirt trail winding ahead. Then I heard it, a sound that made me freeze in my tracks. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the wind, the sound of branches scraping against each other. But then it came again, this low, rhythmic noise, like something moving. I held my breath, listening intently. The noise was subtle, but it was there. It wasn't an animal, not a bird, or a squirrel, or even a deer. It was something else, something that didn't belong. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the trees and the brush, but saw nothing. My heart began to race. I tried to tell myself that it was just the forest, that maybe the wind had shifted, or some animal was rustling in the bushes. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt like something was watching me. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I decided to keep moving. Maybe it was just my imagination, but my instincts were telling me to get out of this part of the forest as quickly as possible. So I walked faster, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. The sound of my footsteps seemed louder now, like the forest itself was listening. The trail began to climb. The incline became steeper, and the trees seemed to close in even tighter. The path was less defined now, with branches overhanging and roots snaking across the ground, forcing me to watch my step more carefully. My breath started to come a little faster, not from exhaustion but from a nagging sense of unease. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. As I made my way higher up the ridge, I came across a small clearing. It was a brief respite from the dense trees, with a few scattered rocks and wildflowers growing between them. The view was incredible. Below me, the valley stretched out in all directions, covered in a blanket of green with a few small houses scattered in the distance. For a moment, I stood there, breathing in the cool air, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had taken over me. But before I could relax, I heard it again. This time it was closer, a rustling sound, but it wasn't from the wind. It was more deliberate, like something or someone was moving just out of sight. I froze, my eyes darting to the trees around the clearing. I couldn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I felt a bead of sweat form at the back of my neck, despite the cool air. I waited for a few minutes, straining to hear anything else. Nothing. No movement. No sound. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't ignore the sensation. The prickling on the back of my neck felt wrong. Against my better judgment, I decided to press on. I wasn't about to let this place get the better of me. But as I continued up the trail, the sense of unease only deepened. The farther I went, the less the path seemed like a trail and more like something that had been abandoned. The trees grew thicker, blocking out more light, and the air grew colder. It wasn't the pleasant coolness I had felt earlier. It felt damp and heavy, like the forest itself was closing in. Eventually, I came to a fork in the trail. One path veered off to the left, heading deeper into the trees, while the other continued up the ridge. I hesitated for a moment. Both paths looked equally untouched, and both seemed to lead farther into the wilderness. But I chose the ridge. I had come this far, and the thought of turning back didn't sit well with me. As I ascended, the feeling of being watched intensified, almost unbearable now. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but something in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. I quickened my pace, my footsteps heavy on the trail, as I pushed through the brush and rocks. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another rock formation, but as I approached, I realized it was something else entirely. A structure. It was small, barely noticeable among the trees, but there it was, an old wooden cabin weathered by time. It looked abandoned, with its roof sagging and walls covered in moss. There was no reason for a cabin to be out here, in the middle of nowhere. Curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't resist the urge to get a closer look. I stepped carefully toward it, my boots crunching the dry ground beneath me. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. The cabin was a relic, abandoned long ago. That much was clear. There was no sign of anyone living here. No fresh footprints, no tire tracks in the dirt. It was just here, like it had been forgotten. I walked around it, my hand brushing against the weathered wood. The door was hanging slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. The inside was dark, and the air smelled musty, like mildew and dust. The walls were bare, save for a few rusted nails and remnants of what might have once been furniture. It didn't seem like anyone had been here for years. But then, as I stepped farther in, I heard it. A soft scraping sound from above. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my ears straining. There it was again. Scraping. Slow. Deliberate. I backed up, my heart pounding. Whatever it was, I didn't want to find out. I turned to leave, but as I stepped back outside, something caught my eye. A trail of footprints, half covered by the fallen leaves, leading away from the cabin and into the dense forest. I don't know why, but I followed them. The footprints were fresh, clearly made within the last day or so. My mind raced. Who else was out here? The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the forest. The further I went, the less it felt like a hike and the more it felt like I was being drawn into something. The trees grew even denser, and the underbrush thickened, making it harder to move forward. I followed the footprints for what felt like miles. My feet were aching, and my mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything. The feeling of being watched never left me, but it had grown more intense, more urgent. It was as if I wasn't supposed to be out here. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw the figure. It was standing in the shadows between two trees, barely visible. A person, or what I thought was a person. It was tall and thin, its outline blurred by the trees behind it. I froze, my blood running cold. Whoever or whatever it was staring straight at me. I couldn't make out any features, just the vague outline of a figure. I took a step back, my heart racing, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I turned and ran. My feet moved faster than they ever had before, the sound of my boots pounding against the dirt filling my ears. I didn't look back. Couldn't. All I've always been someone who enjoys the quiet of nature, not the busy parks, the crowded trails, or the places where you can hear cars buzzing in the distance. No, I've always preferred getting as far away from civilization as I can, hiking deep into forests where the only sounds are the wind in the trees and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. It was in one of these places, in a remote part of the woods I knew well, that I had the scariest experience of my life. The trail I took that day wasn't one of the more popular ones. It wasn't a route with signs and markers telling you when to stop or where to rest. It wasn't the kind of trail you'd find on a map at a visitor center. In fact, most people didn't even know it existed. But I had hiked it before, and I was familiar enough with the path to feel comfortable. I had gone on my own, as I often did. I'd packed a small bag with water, a couple of energy bars, and a basic first aid kit. Nothing too heavy. It was a midweek morning, and the sun had just come up, casting soft, golden light over the trees. The air was crisp, but it had the freshness that makes you feel alive, almost like you could breathe it in forever. The first couple of miles went by without a hitch. The ground was firm underfoot, the forest floor thick with leaves from the previous autumn, the trees a blend of tall oaks and pines. I could hear birds up above, their calls echoing through the quiet woods. The air smelled clean, like dirt and fresh growth, with a hint of pine sap. The trail was narrow and wound in and out of thicker patches of woods, crossing small streams and climbing slight hills. There was a sense of peace here, something I always cherished on these solo trips. The kind of peace you can only find in the middle of nowhere, far from any kind of distraction. But about 3 hours in, something changed. I'm not sure how to explain it. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a subtle shift. The birds stopped singing. I hadn't noticed it immediately, but after a while, I realized that the constant background noise that had accompanied me all morning had gone completely silent. I paused on the trail, listening intently. The stillness was eerie. No wind, no animals, no rustling of leaves. Just complete, unnatural silence. I could feel my pulse quicken as I stood there, my breath sounding too loud in my ears. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, but I tried to push the sensation aside. There was nothing to worry about. The woods had a way of changing, especially when you got deep into them. Maybe the weather had shifted, or perhaps I had walked too far out of the familiar areas. It wasn't like I hadn't seen quiet moments in the forest before, but this felt different. I continued on, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that had settled in my stomach. The path started to get steeper, the trees closer together. A thick mist had begun to creep in, rolling through the trees in slow, low swirls that made everything look blurry and far away. I kept walking, my boots pressing into the soft earth, crunching over fallen twigs. The trail had narrowed to barely a foot wide, and I had to be careful not to slip as I navigated over rocks and roots that had grown uneven over time. The mist wrapped around me like a cold blanket, and my breath began to come out in visible puffs. It wasn't long before I realized that the trail was no longer just narrow. It had almost disappeared. It was as if the forest had taken it back, reclaiming it slowly, turning it into something wild and forgotten. I tried to retrace my steps, but it was hard to find the way back. Every tree looked the same, and the mist made it impossible to see any landmarks. I pulled out my map, but I couldn't even get a good read on where I was. I'd always been good at navigating by landmarks, but here, there was nothing. The trees began to thicken, their trunks twisting and turning in odd shapes. A chill ran down my spine, but I pressed forward. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no wind, no sign of life except for my own. And then it happened. The ground beneath my boots shifted, and I stumbled. My foot slipped, and for a moment, I thought I might fall. I caught myself, but as I looked around, I saw that I wasn't alone. There, just beyond the mist, was someone. I don't know how I didn't hear them approach, but there they were, a figure standing still in the distance, just outside the reach of the mist. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing hiking gear that looked weathered but not old. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing me. I called out, but my voice felt small, swallowed by the stillness. There was no response. A part of me thought about turning around and heading back, but something kept me in place. Maybe it was the strange curiosity I always felt in these situations, or maybe it was the fact that I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be here. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, still staring. I couldn't make out his face. Too much mist, too far away, but the sensation of being watched grew stronger, heavier. I took a step forward, not sure why, but my body seemed to move on its own. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The figure didn't seem to have any real details. There were no clear features, no expression, just a silhouette. The more I tried to focus, the more he seemed to blur at the edges, like something was wrong. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to take another step forward. My heart raced, and I could feel my breath coming in sharp gasps. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, disappeared into the mist, leaving nothing but a hollow silence in its place. I stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the spot where the figure had been. My legs felt weak, my stomach twisted into knots. Had I imagined it? Had I been seeing things? I turned around quickly, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. No sign of the figure, no movement, no sound. It took a moment for me to collect myself. Slowly, carefully, I started walking back. The silence was unbearable now, oppressive, like the woods were pressing in on me from every side. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something was there in the mist just out of sight. I didn't stop walking. I didn't dare look back. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the forest was trying to hold me in place. After what felt like hours, I finally emerged from the thickest part of the woods, the mist slowly dissipating behind me. I could hear birds again, and the faint breeze rustled the leaves. It was almost like the world was slowly waking up from a dream. The trail cleared up, and I found my bearings again. The forest, now familiar, felt safe in a way it hadn't earlier. The air didn't feel as heavy, and the silence that had pressed in on me was finally gone. I made it back to the car without incident, the sun breaking through the trees as I reached the parking area. The sky was blue again, and the weight in my chest began to lift. I looked over my shoulder at the woods one last time, a strange unease lingering in the pit of my stomach. But the feeling wasn't fear anymore. It was something else, something I couldn't explain, but I was glad to be out of there. I've hiked many times since then, but I've never forgotten that day. The woods aren't always what they seem, and sometimes, silence is more unsettling than any noise could ever be.